I think that language is never equal to experience. Its experience is so complex that very often we don't have the language to describe it. Especially when you're listening to women, words are never enough. You have to listen to the silences.
Seen that there are two kinds of people who write history and people who alter the emotional conditions and around which history is remembered. Your work belongs to the latter category. Is there at any point that you felt that listening itself is an intellectual method?
I don't know if I ever thought of it as an intellectual method, but it is what I learned to do initially in activism in the women's movement. Because when we all came together from different locations, women from urban areas, from semi-urban, rural, upper class, lower caste, all of that, we had to figure out a way to talk to each other. How do we talk to each other across these boundaries? And we realized that talking was not as important as listening, especially for those of us who come from very privileged conditions and we are articulate and we're used to saying what we want to say. So in a gathering, we had to sit back. We had to understand that for some women, speech may be a very difficult thing because they've never been allowed to speak. And they may not even have the vocabulary to speak about certain things. Certain things may be totally unspeakable. So we had to learn to listen. And that is where the process of listening began for me, and it became part of my life. And so that later, when I went on to do the research on history, I was not expecting to have to do that. I was still searching for a method. And I was still thinking that perhaps the way to do it is academic. And yet, the more I listened to people, the more I realized that this was not an academic exercise, and it was also very emotionally entangled exercise, because it is your own history. You are hearing it from somebody else, but you're identifying so much with it because you have lived that history. So in that way, it became, I suppose, what you could call an intellectual method, but I never thought of it like that. For me, it was just what I learned to do.
Yeah. So you're talking about, again, some people didn't have the vocabulary to talk because they had never. I wonder that every testimony has two sides of narratives again. One that someone is telling the story and the speaker is still not sure what they want to tell, what they want to say. Did working with memory make you more attentive to hesitation or declaration?
Actually, a bit of both. So it also differs according to gender. I mean, I don't want to make it sound simplistic, but men are so much more used to speaking. So they will speak without hesitation. And that's where the declaration part comes in. Most of them, not all men, of course. I mean, it varies. If you have somebody who is an old man who's speaking to someone much younger than them, there will be difficulty in speaking. So, but with women, the hesitation, the pause, the body language, the wanting to say something and yet not wanting to say it, that was very much part of the way they spoke. And you talked about memory. So the whole way that, for example, men remembered in my interactions with them was that their memories often went back to the more public sort of nature of events. So a lot of men would not recall the personal because I think they did not know how to, or even how to articulate it, and possibly because they weren't that attentive to it. Their attention was taken by the outside world. So whereas women, they mostly recall the personal, but in the personal there were these silences which they could not actually articulate. So memory goes back and forth. Memory does not sort of recount something in a linear fashion. As someone who is exploring memory, you have to be always alert and aware of this, and you have to let people speak in whichever direction they go. If I'm talking to you now about something, and in the process of that sentence something else is sparked off, I'll head in that direction. And I think that's what memory does. It heads in that direction. Sometimes it comes back, sometimes it doesn't. And you have to just see that as part of the process of remembering.
Right. Then coming to the story itself and suffering. There's a certain hidden kind of violence when suffering becomes, if I put it like that, narratively coherent. Once pain finds a way into a story, it risks becoming consumable. Have you ever worried that language can simplify experiences that would otherwise have remained unresolved?
Shruti, you've asked 3 or 4 very, very complex questions in that seemingly simple question that you've put. So let me start with the last thing that you said, that I think that language is never equal to experience. Okay. Its experience is so complex that very often we don't have the language to describe it, and very often words fail us in describing that. If you take the issue of the sexual violence that women experienced during partition, or if you look at the ways in which families pressured women to take their own lives or offer themselves up for sacrifice, shahidi is what they called it. And I'm saying offer themselves up in quotation marks because we don't know. Those women are dead and gone. We don't know what actually governed that step. But if someone was to describe that step, let's say someone wanted to talk to you about sexual violence, how do they describe it in a society where there is hardly a language for sex? So you can't even speak about sex openly. So how do you find the language to speak about violation of your body sexually? How does that deep experience get approximated in words? So that question dogs this kind of research all the time. Where the women who were killed or who were martyred within quotes, we don't have their words or their language at all. So the only way we can hear about that moment is in the language in which men choose to describe it, which is a very different thing from what might have actually happened. So there's always that doubt. Then there is the other question that you asked about how such complex, difficult experiences in the recounting over and over again can be made palatable and consumable. And that does happen. That does happen. And it happens, the more you tell it, the more it sort of assumes a form that and a narrative lucidity it may not earlier have had. But what it does not go away, what language cannot take away, is the fact of that experience itself and the fact that it happened. And as somebody who is listening to someone talking about it, I think you have to try to understand as deeply as you can and use different methods so the words are never enough. Especially when you're listening to women, words are never enough. You have to listen to the silences. You have to look at the body language. You have to look at the things that are left unsaid. You have to look at the hesitation with which women are speaking and are unable to speak about some things. And then you have to make for yourself a narrative out of that, knowing that these are all the things. And that, I think, is a very heavy responsibility on you as researcher, historian, call it what you like, because you're representing something. You're taking an experience from here, putting it into words, your words, taking their words, their hesitations, their lack of language, your words, presenting it to the world. There is somewhere in that process a kind of making palatable does come in. But the only thing that I think rescues it is that you keep on raising questions about that and not saying this is the only thing.
Talking of human experiences, we'll notice that archives, they reward clarity, but human experiences, they are precisely influenced by, or they survive on confusion and contradiction and emotional static. Do you think that intellectual culture rewards clarity too much?
Yes, I think that does, because I think that is the easiest thing to do. And I think it would be very hard for academia. When you say intellectual culture, I'm taking it to mean, say, the academic environment. It would be very hard for academia to think in ambivalences. And yet that is precisely the tension, because life is about ambivalences. As you yourself have said, life is about contradictions, paradoxes, and how do we take those into account? And, this debate also touches on something else, which is a big, how should I say it, obsession with me, actually, which is that intellectual culture or academia tends to rely on something called data, which is largely quantifiable numbers. And if partition is an event that impacted 2 million people, what is a reliable unit of data there that will make your research intellectually acceptable? Meaning, how many people must you interview out of 2 million for it to work? 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 20,000. Then, you realize numbers become meaningless. So I feel that the time has come for us to understand that, yes, this quantifiable data is very important and you can't throw it out. But if you put it against real lives and human narratives, if you put it against something that is called anecdotal evidence and is dismissed because it's merely anecdotal, but if you put those two together, you get a much deeper understanding of our realities. So that's how I think we need to look, and not privilege one thing over the other.
Right. You're talking about that, we can speak to only a handful of people and, millions may be left. So it makes me think about silence. So does silence change across generations? So the silence that the children feel is different from the people who have experienced rupture. Does silence age?
I don't know about aging. I would say yes, the nature of silence changes. And that changes through generations. But it's not only a generational change. It is a change that actually is because of the change in the social context, where certain things which previously may have been unspeakable, it becomes possible to speak them aloud. It becomes a statement of resistance, sometimes even pride, sometimes anger, to be able to speak them aloud and claim them. I mean, let me give you an example again from research on sexual violence. So in our society, in Indian society, a woman who has been subjected to sexual violence is the person who is sadly stigmatized. It's not the rapist, let's say, it's the survivor. as if it was her fault. And that makes for a silence, that she cannot speak about it. She must not speak about it because people must not know. And, as activists in the women's movement, when we fought for changes in the rape law in the early 80s, this is one of the things we demanded, that the trials for sexual violence should be in camera, because the victim's identity, survivor's identity, should be protected. Now, things have changed socially enough, and partly because of the internet and partly because of other reasons, where women are not ashamed. They are saying, why should I take the shame? Rightly. I am the one who's impacted here. Why should he get to go around and brag and I have to be silent? You asked about silence, right? Yeah. So the context has changed and women are now able to speak out. And therefore something like what activists had earlier demanded, the trials for rape should be in camera. Now we are also rethinking that, thinking that in this time, perhaps we were wrong to silence or try to protect women's identity, because now it's possible and women want to speak out. So that kind of social change also makes for a change in the nature of silence. But whether this is, so that's why I'm saying it's not only generational. It's many other things that impact it.
Right. You're talking about this kind of silence, when it comes to women talking about, their violences. And it just makes me wonder that earlier feminist writing had enormous capacity, enormous patience, for complexity. Ambivalences within families and contradictions within women also, and moral complications also. Now there is less tolerance for ambiguity. Have we become intellectually less comfortable with contradiction?
Okay, I would not say that. I think that there is all, if you're talking of feminist writing, let's say, there is all kinds of writing even now. In fact, writing which spans many, many more experiences and paradoxes and ambiguities and so on. But I think, yes, because of the pressure of the internet and social media on instant reactions, and because that social media is so out there in everyone's face, there is a kind of intolerance that is there, which comes out of, I think, just being pushed to have very quick reactions. And this whole cancel culture and all of that's there. So I think, yes, that is there, but that is not the entire terrain. That is one aspect of it. So this is happening while at the same time, writing, thinking, feminism itself is also becoming much more complex and looking at the overlaps and intersections of different kinds of realities.
Okay. Talking of that and coming to publishing, there was a time when publishing was animated by faith. Faith in the thing that difficult thought can alter mindsets, it can alter the process itself. Has your relationship to hope changed over time as a publisher?
That's a very difficult question. Our publishing is still based on hope. But I have to say that after being in this profession for 50 years, more than half a century, I do feel that there is less and less space for the kind of countercurrents that should define a healthy publishing environment anywhere. Publishing has always been something that of course, is made up of big players. But at the same time, there are a number of small players there who are like the conscience of the big players and who keep bringing in new issues and so on. And the openness to that has made for, in a healthy publishing environment, makes for something that we like to call bibliodiversity. That diverse voices, diverse kinds of books, diverse kinds of publishing, all of that make up one whole where people have a lot of intellectual choices about what to access, what not to access, what to read, etc. And writers have the freedom to write about all sorts of issues. That has changed. The battle for people like us is much, much harder. So, and it is much harder for many reasons, including that the environment, including that people don't read that much. So we are producing books, people are hardly reading books. But more than that, I think it is an attitude that people want to read only certain kinds of things. And therefore, we have to fight much harder to find readers. And yet, when we find those readers, so you talked about hope, I still have a lot of hope. Why, in the face of declining sales, everything is, when I see the readers who come to pick up books like the ones we publish, they are all young people. You know, they are young writers, young researchers, just young people who are curious, interested, and I think that's where the hope is. Where if these youngsters are interested in feminism, then everything is not lost. So that's where the hope comes.
So is publishing then an act of optimism against evidence? You sometimes you might release a book which the people might not possess the language to receive. Does transformative literature writing always arrive early?
Yeah, it always arrives early, but it is not noticed early, and that's why it has to battle. So if you look at Dalit literature, we have started seeing in the English publishing world, not in other languages because I don't know about those, but in the English publishing world, we have started to see more and more writings by Dalit writers. But when the process began, the early books were mostly autobiographical and largely by men. There was one rare book, etc., by women, but largely by men. But it arrived early to signal that we are here and we have been here for a long time, but you just haven't noticed and you've not made space for us. And it's not as if publishing opened its doors immediately, but those writers had to battle to get into the publishing world. And they created that space. And once that space has been created, it becomes a hospitable space for others to come in. And then the space itself starts to alter. Excuse me. So the space itself starts to alter and become much more diverse. So what began as a process where initially you had a certain kind of autobiographical writing, plus just the odd occasional academic book, you now have books which go beyond autobiography, which go into poetry, which go into fiction, which go into food cultures, which go into family histories. I mean, there's a whole range of things that is coming out, and that has transformed the nature of publishing and added yet another really, really important dimension to it. So I think that's how the change starts. Always, as you said, transformative voices always arrive early, but they are not really noticed.
Yeah. So official histories, they tend to flatten emotion into event. But if you look at ordinary lives, they are influenced by the atmospheres around them. So fear in a household, shame around a table, or inherited caution. Right? Do societies transmit emotional climates without realizing it across generations?
I don't know. That's a tough question. I think what you said initially about transforming official histories, transforming emotion into event, or actually focusing on event rather than emotion. That is very true. And that is, in a sense, also a limitation. Because if you're focusing on event, you are actually likely to focus on the most major events, and a whole lot of other things get left out. And also, how do you, because history is linear and chronological, how do you deal with, say, a country like ours where events are happening at the same time in multiple places and they are very different events? So, how do you build a history that can be both lateral and linear? That is a difficult problem. Do families pass down the emotional baggage that people carry? And by this, I don't mean to be disrespectful to the emotions that are there. I think they do, but I think the part of this process of passing down is also because it is often unresolved. In our societies, the way that we have dealt with traumatic histories, we have imagined that you just push them under the carpet and they'll go away. And everywhere across the world, it is clear now that that is not the way to do it. And I don't think that anywhere in the world we have found a satisfactory way to deal with emotionally traumatic, emotionally difficult pasts. But we have found ways which are at least a little better than pretending that wo apne aap hi chala jayega. That is what we have pretended in India, and that is what hasn't actually worked. So psychiatrists working on traumatic memories will tell you that it may not be evident that that memory or that emotion is being passed down, but somewhere it will rear its head and come up in the most unexpected circumstances. And because you have not either identified it or dealt with it, you won't know how to deal with it at that level. So what do you then do about that? And these things remain unresolved and they keep festering, and then they come out in some way or the other at some point, and we don't really know when. We don't know enough about this. And I think we need to do a lot more research to find out.
Right. So, talking of explaining experiences, some experiences are damaged by if you explain them. The more you explain, you move further away from them. Have you ever experienced in your work have you ever felt a lack of language, or that you found it hard to look for a language, not poetically, but ethically?
Yes, often. Often, and the choice is a hard one, especially if you are receiving that, if you're the one who's listening and people are telling you their stories. Of course, you're all the time faced with a lack of language, but you're also all the time faced with its opposite. That if you provide a hospitable listening environment, people say things to you and trust you with what they have said, which is really scary, because merely the articulation of that can be quite dangerous for them. And you then, as somebody who has received that, you are faced with the question that, is this something that I should reveal? Because the person has said it to me fully aware of what they're doing. Or do I make an ethical choice here and say, no, I can't do this because this is going to impact that person's life? And often people don't know or don't realize when they speak something to you and you're the researcher who's taking that speech into some form of writing, I don't think people realize the permanence of writing. बात बोल दी and then आपके अंदर से कुछ देर के लिए निकल गई. It never quite goes away. But then on paper, it's there permanently. So what do you do? So I'll give you again an example that helps to illustrate that in my work, we are creating an archive in Zubaan of women's histories. And these are done through interviews with women. So in one of the interviews, there is a woman who talks about she and her friends having collectively actually killed someone and gotten away with it. I mean, gotten away. It's a very complex story, but she talks about that. Now, for us, there's this question: should we keep that there or not? And so we went back and asked her, and she said, "Yeah, keep it there. I'm not scared. I've said it." But it's not that easy.
Yeah.
Not that easy to do. So what do you do there? You remain true to the person, you remain true to your sense of protecting them, or whatever, I don't know. So the choices are quite hard like that. And it is a negotiation that you have to do all the time with what you hear and what you tell, or how much of that you tell. So my way around it is to choose to keep the silence that the person wishes to retain, and not violate their trust and put something out there that might endanger their lives, but to talk about the problem and to say, this is the choice that I was confronted with, not with this person, but in general. So you protect that person's identity somehow, but you also raise the issue of what makes it so difficult.
That makes me wonder, do societies remember violence more than they remember love? Because violence leaves behind spectacle, it leaves behind dates and monuments. And if you look at love, tenderness, it has almost no archive. So, do histories almost completely forget love and remember brutality?
Again, not something that's easy to answer. I think it's true that love, because it is so sort of difficult to, to trap into words, to feel, to express, is often not noticed. You're quite right that violence, and especially violent events, not violence, because there is a kind of violence that exists in our lives that is a daily violence, and that is completely unnoticed, especially domestic violence towards women. So, but spectacular, violent events, yes, they are remembered for, and there are so many things that make up the memory, the spectacle, and so on and so forth. Whereas love, the process of love, the emotion of love, these are also private, and these are also processes, so they are a bit difficult for history to capture. And yet it is not as if history has not captured spectacular loves. It has done.
But most of them have ended in violence.
Most of them may have ended in violence. But yes, kings and queens and, Jodha Akbar and all of that kind of thing is there. It's not like those love stories are not there. But otherwise, generally, it is a bit difficult. Although I know that books have been written. There is a very interesting book on Europe and love, histories of love in Europe. I can't remember I think it's Luisa Passerini, but I'm not sure. But anyway, people are working on it.
Talking of survival, so you have studied survival in rupture, after rupture. So survival itself is complicated. Sometimes it softens people, sometimes it hardens them, sometimes it makes them silent. What have you learned about the psychological cost of survival?
I have learned that again, I'll go back to talking about women, that women are great survivors. They are people who just pick up the pieces and move on. They often do not have the luxury, so I use that word within quotes, to let despair take over. They have to get on with it. You look at what happened to the widows of the 1984 pogrom violence in Delhi, anti-Sikh violence in Delhi. These were young women. They had never been out of the house. They had never been out on their own. Suddenly they are widowed. They are thrown on their own devices. They have hardly any support. And if they have any support, it is from families who are waiting to get the money that these women are getting. And yet, barring one or two of them who gave up, each one restarted her life. Women learned how to ride on a bus. They learned how to negotiate government offices. They read and wrote and learned how to study. They brought their children up, and they have created their lives. And now the kids are grown up and everything. Now, in such dire circumstances, how do they do it? But women do it all the time. So I've really learned that survival is very, very hard. And even when no system steps in, the state doesn't step in or anything like that, women will pick up the pieces. It'll take them longer. But if the state steps in and provides even something small, women will make the best of that opportunity. So you see the millions of women post-partition, widows and women who had been abducted, etc., who were trained in these ITIs across the country to stitch uniforms. And they used to make uniforms for class 4 employees of the government after the colonial uniform changed and a new uniform came in, all done by women, all partition survivors, all who lost their families. But they made their lives because they got this much help and they used that help. So that's what I've learned, really.
Now I'm interested in, what do intellectuals mourn privately, not politically or publicly? What is it, do you think, has disappeared from the Indian cultural life in your lifetime?
So, if you were to go back to the way you framed that question the first time, I would say I don't have an answer because I don't count myself among that group of people called intellectuals. If you said, what do feminist activists mourn privately, I might have been able to answer that, because that's
so
where...
sure, let's then reframe the question.
No, that's where I kind of locate myself. But the second part of your question actually frames it very nicely, that what do we think, or what has been lost? I think a great deal has been lost, and that has to do with both activism and intellectual activity. I think what has been lost is the ability, or how should I say, the possibility of dissenting and holding the state to account. So when we were young, we used to be out on the streets all the time protesting about this and that and the other. We were never stopped. We had to take permission. We had permission. You could go up to Boat Club, and then you could send a delegation of people to the Houses of Parliament, and the concerned minister or his secretary, their secretary, would come out, meet them, receive the memorandum, take it seriously. That interaction between the state and its citizens was a very, very important interaction. I mean, the state might not do what you demand, but you had a sense of that this is my state. I can hold it to account. I can ask. I elected these people. They are accountable to me. I think alongside that, the whole possibility of our society being so diverse and so rich in its diversity, that is being lost. So you can't have conversations about that which might allow you to learn from each other and to continue learning, I think that richness also is lost. So in intellectual activity, I think that is the loss, that the possibility of doing complex research which gives out complex answers that people are finding quite difficult now to do. And activism, again, this interaction with the possibility of protest, the possibility of making demands, being listened to, negotiating, talking with the state, rejecting it, fighting it, all of these things, which are part of any citizen-state interaction or any democratic interaction, that I think is something
Missing.
that we are losing.